Good afternoon, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. My name is Savita Iyer, and I'm the senior editor of the Penn Stater magazine. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session titled Celebrating Jubilee, the Histories and Meanings of Juneteenth. Live closed captions are available for this webinar. You can access them by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom video window and then clicking Show Subtitle. You may also customize your caption view by clicking the stream text link posted in the chat. And we're live streaming today's presentation, which will be archived and available on our website. Our guest today is Clarence Lang, the Susan Welch Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of African American Studies. Dean Lang is a scholar of African American urban history and social movements. He's the author of 2 books and has co-edited 2 additional volumes. More information is available in the chat. In today's discussion, Dean Lang will offer a brief history of Juneteenth and discuss its enduring significance in African American life as a critical moment in Black people's journey toward emancipation. A particular area of interest is understanding the impact of Juneteenth becoming recognized as a federal holiday in 2021, which coincided with the nation's commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa race riot. Dean Lang believes that Juneteenth is a reminder that African American history is a narrative of both change and continuity, one that encompasses continuing progress as well as setbacks in the nation's reckoning with its racial past and present. Dean Lang, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the Penn State Alumni Association for the invitation to participate in the speaker series. And thanks also go to my colleague, Savita. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for recruiting me into this event. I look forward to engaging with Savita later in the program and with those of you who are attending this webinar. And I appreciate your time and attention. Last but not least, credit goes to Jenny Hamer for her assistance with the slides. If you like them, then you can thank her. If not, then the fault is all mine. I want to speak briefly about the history and continuing significance of Juneteenth, this commemoration of African American emancipation that began in Texas in 1865 and became a federal holiday in 2021. And hearkening back to the introduction, the overarching point I wanted to make is that while Juneteenth is certainly an important moment to celebrate, it illustrates the contradictory nature of African American history, what we might call a tragic sameness, or less pessimistically, a changing same. And what I want to suggest is that Juneteenth and its recognition as a national holiday reminds us that African American history has been an odyssey of both resilience and advancement on the one hand, and on the other, staggering disappointment and painful setbacks as Black people have fought to achieve the full meanings of freedom and democracy for themselves, and I would add, in the process, also expanding the meanings of freedom and democracy more generally for all in this society. My hope is that we appreciate the importance of both change and continuity, as Savita mentioned, change and continuity in African American history. And this approach avoids the error of either A, congratulating ourselves about the progress we believe Black people have experienced as we overlook the persistence of racial hierarchy, and to be more specific, white racism, white supremacy, and limiting Black freedom. So that avoids that error of congratulating ourselves so very quickly. Or at the other extreme, B, reducing the African American experience simply to a long narrative of racial oppression, which commits another error, right? Ignoring the fact that Black people's place in the United States has not been static and unchanging across time. That is to say, progress has occurred. It's important in this sense to understand that Black people have been actors in their own history and not simply just acted upon. So really balancing those two variables. Next slide, please. Okay, so how did Juneteenth begin? And there are many places to start. think probably the most appropriate place for the sake of time is to go back to the US Civil War. That epic struggle waged between Unionists and Secessionists, or the Confederacy, around the question of slavery in this nation. At the beginning of January 1863, the Abraham Lincoln presidency issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all those individuals being held as chattel, slaves, in the secessionist territories, quote, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Now, it wasn't until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865 that slavery was legally abolished. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not end the institution of slavery. I want to be clear, too, that the Emancipation Proclamation scope was restricted to the Confederate States, where Lincoln had no power at the time to even enforce this order. So the proclamation, for example, did not apply to a slaveholding state like Missouri, a place that I've studied in my own work, which had slaves but did not secede from the Union. For those of us who study African-American history, the key significance, certainly from my standpoint, of the Emancipation Proclamation is that Lincoln acknowledged what already had become a fact, which is that the more than 3.5 million enslaved African-Americans concentrated in the South were using the chaos and disorder created by the war to emancipate themselves, fleeing plantations, aiding the Union Army as it advanced, and otherwise undermining the Confederacy from within when and where they could. So I begin, right, as I think about the Emancipation Proclamation, its impact is how it, how Black people use their agency, exercise their agency to change their conditions. And the proclamation, in many ways, was a recognition of that fact. Next slide. But Black resistance was not possible in the same ways everywhere. Texas, for example, was the westernmost part of the Confederacy, and many of its plantations were far from the Union lines and isolated from news. So it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that's 2 months after the war had ended officially, that Union troops, led by General Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas, and began alerting the 250,000 enslaved people in that state that the war was over and that chattel slavery had been smashed. The celebration of that news was the beginning of a holiday celebrated primarily by Black Texans at the time, known as Juneteenth. So there we have it. In Texas, it also became known as Emancipation Day, or more ambitiously, America's Second Independence Day. And in the years and decades that followed, Juneteenth would be commemorated with religious services, parades, picnics, baseball games, fishing, so on and so forth. And I'm not enough of a specialist to tell you when this tradition began, but certainly one tradition that emerged was the serving of red foods and drinks. So strawberry lemonade, red punch, right? Strawberry soda years later, red velvet cake, red beans and rice. And so to some extent, the palette of the slides are a nod to that particular theme. Next slide, please. In fact, celebrating Juneteenth became part of a larger post-war project, I want to argue, of Reconstruction, through which Black people experienced and helped build interracial democracy in the United States. Let me state that another way, that following the war, African Americans were actors, full actors and participants in this really important period of interracial democracy in the United States that we now call Reconstruction. And without dwelling on these particular amendments and pieces of legislation, I just want to highlight a few of these of the provisions that made that possible. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, which abolished slavery. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, which extended national citizenship to African Americans. That was reinforced by the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, which extended citizenship protections to African Americans, due process, In the 15th Amendment, 1870, in fact, the extension of the vote, apologies for that gap, there was in 1870. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a supplement to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and covered public accommodations, restaurants, theaters, public conveyances, and the like. But what these amendments and laws, which function at the federal level, don't capture were the daily activities on the part of the newly freed African Americans and freed, that is, Black people who had been freed before the Civil War, in the community building, the renewal of family bonds, the drive to own land and property, the exercise of the vote, the occupation of elected and appointed office, the ways in which African Americans experience these freedoms and build communities and institutions to advance their collective interests as well as their personal aspirations. Very important moment in African American history, certainly American history as well, because many of the reforms of that period were extended across society. So the creation of orphanages, compulsory public education, these were also outcomes of the period of Reconstruction that certainly had their roots in the interests of African Americans, but in their impact affected certainly Southerners and others across the board. Next slide, please. But by the end of the 19th century, the emancipatory meanings of Juneteenth were diminished by a counter-revolution on the part of the former secessionists and their allies to quote unquote redeem the South. This was ultimately countenanced by the federal government, and this occurred on two levels. So there were a number of legal strategies. If we think, for example, about the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1877, without going into much detail, happy to talk about it at the end, but it essentially was a moment in a contested presidential election where the North and the South, if you will, healed their wounds around the war, reunified at the expense of Black freedom, essentially returning the South and the newly freed African Americans to the former secessionists. You then had, beginning in 1890 in Mississippi, state constitutional conventions that began to implement certain provisions, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, the grandfather clause being if your grandfather voted, then you were eligible to vote, which excluded by nature African Americans' literacy and property requirements to vote. These ways that on the surface were perhaps race neutral, but in their intent and impact were designed to basically drive Black people out of the voting public. And then a series of US Supreme Court rulings culminating in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the doctrine of separate and equal, which undermined the impact of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So there were these legal strategies that occurred at the executive level, at the state constitutional level, state law, and in terms of US Supreme Court rulings that drove people, Black people, out of the polity. But there were also, of course, extra legal strategies in the form of mob violence, terrorism, harassment, the emergence of white vigilante groups, of which the Ku Klux Klan was simply one. And together, those legal and extra legal strategies essentially stripped Black people of the citizenship that they had fought hard to achieve and exercise by 1910. A new regime comes into place in the South that is not exactly slavery, but reproduces many of its aspects. Historians refer to this as Jim Crow segregation. Next slide. The point, though, is that despite being effectively stripped of their citizenship by 1910, Black people continue to build and fortify their communities, institutions, and culture, which they then took with them as they migrated from the South to the Northeast and the Midwest, and then to the West in the 20th century. And there you see a mapping of this massive Great Migration, which in fact helped to spread the celebration of Juneteenth across both Southern and Northern Black communities. So you can imagine individuals from Texas who in the 1940s and 50s and afterwards went to places like Los Angeles, Oakland, Portland, Seattle. Those cultural celebrations traveled with them, right? So Juneteenth, which began in the state of Texas, certainly in the 20th century began to take on a more national character as Black people voted with their feet and left the South in large numbers. It is a commentary on the resilience of Black communities that Juneteenth continued amid the certainly horrific conditions of the Jim Crow South, as well as in the grim conditions in the so-called promised land of the North, where millions of Black people relocated to enjoy more freedom. And I want to make the point here that certainly there were push factors leading Black people to quit the South in large numbers. But I certainly don't want to propagate the myth that the North was a land of milk and honey. Certainly, millions of Black people left and didn't return, going to places like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., so on and so forth, where they were able to exercise the vote, had better access to education, to other kinds of freedoms, but it would be a mistake to say that their problems were solved. Next slide. In fact, in labor and housing markets, their presence was met on a number of occasions by white mob violence. And so one of the features of the early 20th century were a series, right? A long series of racial massacres that occurred, for example, in Springfield, Illinois, East St. Louis, Illinois, 1917, the Red Summer of 1919. And the Red Summer refers to this summer where across the nation, there were these racial pogroms visited upon Black communities, waged by white civilians, but also white law enforcement and backed up by the force of law that occurred, reached a height in 1919, and then the Tulsa massacre in 1921, which was distinctive in one respect. It was distinctive in one respect, that one of the outcomes of that was the destruction of a Black commercial district, Black Wall Street it was called, that had been developed in the early 20th century. So the racism, the violence was a response not to, as the myth had it, Black failures, lack of achievement, but also in some ways inspired by the fact that Black people were finding it successful to acquire property, political influence, making inroads into certain job categories where they had not existed. And you see visualizations of the response that occurred. Interestingly, Juneteenth celebrations declined during the decades of the modern civil rights struggle of the 1930s, 1950s, and 1960s. So it will continue to be practiced, but you could say that celebrations went into recession. You could find evidence in local communities of Juneteenth celebrations occurring locally. But Juneteenth experienced a revival nationally in popularity in the late 1970s and early 1980s when it became a state holiday in Texas. Next slide, please. And here we see President Joe Biden signing the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, a very important moment in the celebration of Juneteenth in African-American history, US history as well, if you will. But the paradox of this is that at the moment that Juneteenth was first honored as a federal holiday in 2021, that was the same year as the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa race riot. Next slide, please. And this, of course, occurred, all of this, at a moment of, I would say, powerful racial reckoning that took place in communities and on campuses around the nation. So we think, for example, of the George Floyd killing in 2020 and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter activism that had grown since 2013 in response to a series of police and vigilante killings involving Black people. This, of course, at the same time as a global COVID pandemic was occurring and having particular impact on Black communities, not exclusively, of course, but certainly in ways that were that amplified many of the economic and social conditions that African-American communities, certainly urban communities, rural communities as well, had been facing. Occurs at the same time as the ongoing public debate about Confederate monuments in the South and other continuing legacies of the Civil War, and of course, resurgent demands for reparations among segments of the Black public sphere, reparations, not just simply for the legacies of slavery, but for Jim Crow segregation, housing discrimination and segregation that occurred in the North, the theft and destruction and denial of wealth acquisition for Black households and communities. So we have in this particular moment, next slide, as we have always had, the duality of the Black experience, progression and regression, all at the same time. And my argument is that this, again, is emblematic of the riddle, the paradox, if you will, of African-American community as this balance of the changing same. And so in some ways, there's a poignancy to celebrating Juneteenth at this moment, as his case has been historically, where we reckon with where the nation has been, but also the road that the nation still very much has to continue to travel. And on that note, next slide, I'll leave you with some suggested readings that, I hope that you, if you're interested further in the topic of Juneteenth, or more specifically, or more generally, that is to say, about African-American history, which frames the importance of Juneteenth, some selections there, even added one of my books, why not? But I hope that you'll take the opportunity to read further. And I hope that these comments were suggestive, maybe not comprehensive, but a good idea of how we understand and think about, and at this moment discuss Juneteenth and its significance. And I think I've hit my goal of keeping my comments to about 20 minutes. We're closer to 25, but hopefully that gives us plenty of time for your questions and questions from Savita and comments from those of you participating in this webinar. Again, thank you for your attendance and your attention. I look forward to what comes next.
Thank you, Clarence. Thank you so much. So we do have some questions here to guide us into the next part of this discussion. Let's start with President Biden, June 2021, signing or declaring Juneteenth a federal holiday, and all these, celebrations that are taking place across the country in different communities. Here in State College, we just had our big block party this past weekend. So I was wondering if you could comment about not just the celebratory aspect of Juneteenth in different sectors, educational institutions and communities and so on, but also just in general, the observation of Juneteenth, in the American corporate sector, and how important it is to, that this uptake should continue.
Yeah. So, if I'm, well, let me make sure that I'm understanding the question, Savita. So we're at this moment where Juneteenth is better known. There are celebrations that occur. And so your question is what is the meaning of that? How do we understand that? How do we receive that? Can you redirect maybe a little bit? So yeah.
Yes, I mean, just in terms of, how important it is that the celebration become more and more widespread, the knowledge of what Juneteenth is.
Yeah.
And I, add to that in both senses of what you've discussed today, right? As a celebration, but also as a moment to pause and rethink about the progress that we've made, but the challenges that we still have to overcome.
Yeah, so I think in some ways that you've answered the question in a sense that it's a moment to reflect as much as anything. And I don't think it's coincidental that we see Juneteenth emerge in the way that it has outside of this moment that we've been in some ways for the past two decades. So on the one hand, as an African-Americanist, I'm an African-American historian, I welcome the opportunity for us to think and talk about and discuss African-American history whenever that occurs. But I think for the as a broader purpose, I think it's a good exercise in us disrupting the narrative that I think too many of us have. Certainly, I had imbued that as a child of America as being exceptional.
Mhm.
And I think Juneteenth, while it allows us to celebrate where we've come, it also prods us to think about the promises unmet, the dreams deferred or put off altogether. And I think I think we're at a moment where where that is a very healthy and I would say necessary exercise. Now, it's going to get commercialized, right? And so there's no, if we're going to commercialize Christmas and so on and so forth, that will happen with Juneteenth as well. So certainly it has its impact in terms of how it plays itself out on the market. We live in the United States, so that's going to occur. But I think that the point is for us to have ethical engagement with this and to think about and to make sure that we don't pat ourselves on the back too quickly, even as we look back and wonder at where we've come as a nation. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And, picking up on your point about, ethical discussions, informed and important decisions, how, if in any way, has the, I don't want to use the word popularity, but I guess the widespread knowledge about Juneteenth changed the way, educators in universities like this one, or even in schools, approach the teaching of Black history. And again, in context of what you said about this paradox of the changing same.
Yeah. So I think it becomes a good moment to, I'll come back to one of the comments that I said, right? That we have to, for educators, it becomes an important exercise on how we balance this impulse to, at one end of the spectrum, to celebrate ourselves, look at how good we are and what we've done, right? But on the other, not going into this narrative that nothing has changed for Black people in the United States since 1619, right, or what have you. It's been one long train of tragedy, tragedy and disappointments, one thing after the other. And it helps to put Black people at the center of their own history, because when you do that, then it's easier to see that it's not just simply been one particular narrative, one way or the other. It's been the combination of these things that Black people's positions have changed, but with it, right, those advances, those triumphs, the mechanisms of racism have changed as well. And so we can celebrate the triumph over certain forms, but we have to keep our attention on emergent forms that we have to analyze and interpret. So there's a vigilancy that I think that can create as well. And certainly it has to be more than just simply us telling stories about the past, but also interpreting that in ways that help inform how we think about the moment that we inhabit right now, and how do we position ourselves to make things better. That's a very Pat Trite way of putting it, but I hope that suffices.
Sure. One of our guests has a question about how we could have these discussions at home, with families, and appropriate ways to convey that message to children of varying ages.
Yes. So let me start with the fact that the bibliography that I shared, I think that the slides will be available. So if for no other reason than that, people can see some of the works that are available. In fact, I think that there's a lot more literature that exists, children's literature on Juneteenth, than there is for scholars.
Sure.
And so if you go to the website of the National African American Museum and Cultural Center in DC, I'm botching the name of the new museum that's open. Yeah. They have a fantastic list of readings, particularly for younger readers, in ways that I certainly don't remember as a child, my own self. And so that's a good place to start if that's what we're talking about. How do you have these conversations, I assume, with children at home?
Absolutely.
There is a wealth of literature that exists that comes into that in many different kinds of ways. And so we have an embarrassment of riches on that end. We still need more scholarly works done on Juneteenth, I would argue, for those of us who are experts and specialists. But for broad reading audiences, there's quite a bit that's out there. And it's pretty easily available. You go to Amazon, right? Barnes and Nobles, the regular houses for that. So
yeah, that's great to know. So let's go back again to, talk a little bit more about the paradox and the changing same. in your opinion, one of our guests is asking, is the current occurrence of simultaneous regression and progression in this moment different in any way than in previous eras? And if so, what makes it different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And here's where, I'm leaning more into interpretation than perhaps fact, which is what historians do, right? Part of what we do is interpretive. I will argue that I think that one of the key differences at this moment is that that I think makes this moment a bit different than what's preceded it. If we're talking about this new millennium, right, the 2000 teens and the early 2020s that we currently inhabit, is that we've lived through the presidency of the first, occupant, first president of African descent.
Mhm.
And so it was very interesting to see that at that moment, when you have a Black man come into the nation's highest office, that occurs at the same time that the nation is celebrating a number of 50th year anniversaries, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, that Supreme Court ruling, the 1963 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and what have you. And that's also a moment where we see a spike in this very horrendous racialized violence directed at people of African descent at the same time. That in some ways sharpened the paradox. And I would argue that much of what's occurred after that presidency, my opinion, I don't speak for Penn State, right, or the Penn State Alumni Society. We have to understand that as being a long-term reaction to the Obama presidency. Now, I've written a book, it's on the list, that lays out some criticisms of the Obama presidency, and I try and take that on. So this is not about creating heroes and villains in that sense. But I think that has been a very unique moment to live through. I think in some ways that younger folks for whom President Obama was just kind of, it was a thing, I think probably can't fully appreciate in the ways that some of us, who, speaking for myself, didn't think he would live to see that day and didn't think it was possible at all. I think that's a really important historical juncture in terms of how we make sense of that moment and what's followed that.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, going back again to Juneteenth becoming more, widespread. And there's a question here about this notion of, I guess, quote unquote, appropriation, right?
Yeah.
How some people feel that they perhaps should not, sort of, I guess, partake in in something that has very deep traditions and significance for Black people in the US. They feel that either they should not partake, or how can they partake and acknowledge the importance of this date and celebrate it without being disrespectful or, laying claim to something that's not, theirs as such. But you talked earlier on, Clarence, you spoke about African American history, and you also spoke about American history, right?
Yeah.
And Juneteenth as being American history. So can you just talk a little bit more about that, and as Juneteenth exemplifying, I guess, what I also regard as, American ideals, right? The values that are so foundational to this nation, like freedom, liberty, resilience, and strength. If we can place Juneteenth in that, at that context of American history, right?
So this is tricky. I mean, I've been in some conversations and it comes up, to whom does Juneteenth belong to?
Yeah.
Who ought to celebrate it? And what does that mean? So the question that you posed, I think that question came in advance.
Yeah.
I can certainly appreciate the sensitivity and the sentiment there. I would argue that even though Juneteenth grows out of African American history, grows out of Black culture, I don't believe that it ought to be, its acknowledgement, its commemoration ought to be limited simply to Black people, in the same way that I don't believe that African American history as a field is simply the province of Black people, right? It's a question of scholarship or what have you. I mean, I grew up in Chicago, and every year there was St. Patrick's Day. I didn't always wear green, but that was kind of a moment that the city embraced, celebrated, dyed the Chicago River green, so on and so forth. I'm going to say something contradictory. I think the best way to acknowledge, and so I think it's for everyone. Now I'm going to say something that might on the surface appear contradictory. I hope not too contradictory.
Yeah.
I think we have to understand, though, Juneteenth as African American history, and not graft it onto this narrative of American history as ever in upward progress.
Right.
Right? Because
Yes.
then that undermines and diminishes it.
Sure.
Right? And then it gets absorbed as part of this long narrative of how unique and special we Americans, right, those of us in the United States, are. And I deeply believe that we have to combat that myth of what historians refer to as American exceptionalism, that the United States is at every and any time exceptional, different, better, so on and so forth. So to graft it onto that is a disservice to the holiday.
Yeah.
But to incorporate Juneteenth into a critical, not to say dismissive, but critical reading of the US historical past, I think is a good thing.
Sure.
And so from that standpoint, I think that everyone who has an interest in weighing in ought to do so. But just remember what the project is. It's not just simply us affirming what we assume to be these enduring values. And in fact, in some ways, it becomes a critique of that particular narrative, I think, necessarily.
Sure, absolutely. But that critique it's a hard message to get across more and more these days, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to combine two questions that have come in, right? So we here have, you mentioned George Floyd and the increased conversation around DEI and B, and here at Penn State, we have been having a lot of momentum on that front as well, but we also are entering a climate where there is a lot of pushback against that, right? So how do we, as, Penn State, a land-grant institution, how do we, sort of take the lead and educate the Commonwealth, about the history of Juneteenth, as you've said, the paradox, and so on, and how do we kind of keep up this conversation?
So the question that you posed, in my sense, if you don't mind me taking some liberties, I think it's a question not so much about Penn State exclusively, about where we are more generally in higher education, particularly public higher education today. And I think that our university, as other land-grant institutions, we're a microcosm of the broader dynamics occurring in society. And if I had a good answer to that, I could afford to retire and I wouldn't be working at this point. So I think that this remains a work in progress. I think we have to be, collectively, clear in what our principles are in terms of the kind of campus environment and by extension society we want to have, and be straightforward and supporting those things that move us in that direction, and being equally as adamant about the things that go against that. There are some dynamics that exist outside of this university and others. So a Supreme Court ruling, for example, that changes the standing practice around the use of race in admissions. We have to abide by that as an institution. But we also have to allow for the people that we hire, who are faculty, the students that we recruit, the staff who have the wherewithal to speak openly about the kind of campus and society that we want to have. And in all the spaces where we can, give those individuals the support they need, to be included in the key decisions on this topic and to move things forward. I think this is a really important moment for scholars to do the things that they do in terms of holding forth in the public square, in terms of their research, in terms of the things they do in terms as public scholars or scholars who are public facing as well. But we can't have, we will always struggle, I will argue, around these issues of, if we want to call them diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or social justice, if people prefer. We will not resolve them outside of addressing this more broadly in our society. We can be a laboratory for some ideas, but we have to figure out at the same time how we shepherd those discussions. So there's been some good work that's been done at Penn State, but Penn State, as is the case at any institution at this moment, in the middle of this particular historical period that we're in, we have to continue to strive to do better. We must.
Sure, absolutely. And that segues into another interesting question that you might have seen that came in earlier, right? The whole sort of generational approach to the discussion that you've just mentioned, this sort of intersection of ageism and racism, the writer said. Like how, if that's a question you wish to take, Clarence, like how can you address that? I guess a lot of times we do have a tendency to think of things as generational, and like certain discussions that happen now cannot be had with people of a previous generation. Is that something that you can talk about a little bit?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's so my reading of most social movements is that they have tended to be intergenerational. So even if we think about, for example, the so-called civil rights movement, which we associate with the baby boom, right? This boom in young people who went off to school and who engaged culturally and politically and intellectually and otherwise. We tend to think of that as a youth movement. And in a lot of respects, that was the case. But certainly many of the younger civil rights activists took counsel and collaborated with activists, veteran activists who had cut their teeth at earlier periods of time. So if we think, for example, I can give you a number of examples, but Ella Baker, Amzie Moore, really important advisors to younger civil rights activists and organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality, had their formative political experiences decades earlier, during the Depression in the 30s, during the World War II period of the 1940s, and so forth. And so those linkages have been there. So in some respects, because the 60s is such a touchstone for how people think about activism today, we go there and we make a number of presumptions about how things unfolded. And there's a presumption that there are only people under 30 who are engaged and involved. And in fact, the actual history on the ground was not the case at all. And so I do think that to the extent, and I'm making a leap here, but to the extent that people believe that their ideas and solutions are novel and original, and that they have to make a break with those who came before them, we do that not only to our shame, but also to our own, if you will, undoing. Because historically, it's been those intergenerational linkages that have made efforts at social transformation and change strong, right? One generation feeding from the others. Not that there aren't disagreements, right? But that these things grow out of engagement, and that's always been the case.
Absolutely, yeah. Somebody's asking, how did the term Jubilee originate with this celebration?
Yeah, so I did put that in the title, and I heard from a good colleague of mine who pressed me a little bit on that usage, and so that's a term that had religious significance. This idea of God was involved in the plight of those who were enslaved, and that they were going to endure this moment, but there was going to be this radical break that would occur. And that kind of language and religious fervor is part of what fortified and steeled African Americans for that long-standing fight. right? Because imagine, you know, in the 1850s, for example, if you were someone who was held as chattel, there was resistance, but there was no indication that slavery was going to end. All you could see behind you were people who had been enslaved, and potentially all you could see in front of you was that. And so to resist in whatever small or major ways occurred, that took in some ways a leap of faith. And so the notion of Jubilee undergirded that particular kind of spirit, right?
Yeah.
That they were being watched out for and that their moment would come. And certainly in the context of the Civil War, right? If we think about how Black people exercise their agency and self-activity to help shape the outcome of the war. And that's one of the points that I always want to emphasize, that Black people weren't sitting around waiting for things to happen to them or for them. Whether we're talking about the abolitionist movement, and we think about, you know, right, we think about white abolitionists and we forget about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and what have you. Whether we're talking about the abolitionist movement, whether we're talking about how Black people took advantage of the war to abscond, flee from plantations. If we think about Black people, that's right, the Underground Railroad or what have you, which existed prior to the war. But the fight in the Civil War on the part of Black people, that they've been actors in that. And that has to come from some sense that not only that you have the efficacy to fight, but that you can fight and win, right?
Yes.
And so this notion of Jubilee helped to ground that particular spirit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So now I know you don't really like to talk about yourself, Clarence, but perhaps you can talk briefly about your own, you know, research and scholarly work, and if you have any new research interests that you're looking to explore.
So I do a lot of administration these days, and so I barely have time to write my name. But heretofore, as you mentioned in the introduction, you know, my work has been primarily in African American social movement, urban and labor history, the intersections of those, primarily in the Midwest. So I look at St. Louis, Missouri, between the 1930s and 1970s. So I've been really, that's the area that I'm you know, been really interested in. St. Louis and Missouri being an interesting place because you have there the convergence of the histories, the politics, the cultures of the South, if you will, and the North coming together in these really interesting kinds of ways. And so for me, those kinds of territories, whether we're talking about Missouri, Maryland, you know, Tennessee, Kentucky, help us in microcosm to tell the broader story of African American history. You know, currently I am working with a couple of other collaborators on a co-edited book on the state of African American urban history, which hopefully will be out this fall. So I try and stay active as well. But that's why opportunities like these are so welcome to me, because they help me to remind me that I got into academia because of the scholarship, right? And
absolutely
not necessarily because of the administration, which is important.
Yes.
But I think it's good to remain as active as one can in a role like mine as a scholar as well.
Sure.
Particularly since I have such phenomenal faculty in my college. I'm going to brag about my college.
Yeah,
Who do
please
good
do.
work, and I do my best to try and keep up with them as best as I can.
All right. Well, I think so. This next question, maybe this is going to be our last. I guess I'm going to phrase with something, combine one of my questions with a question that somebody here has posed. And, you know, you're an educator, so always talk, and a scholar. And, you know, there's this notion of teachable moments, as you know, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about a teachable moment with respect to Juneteenth and everything that we have talked about here today, the question here is that many white people reason that if their families didn't own slaves, civil rights has nothing to do with them. How do you respond to that in this a teachable moment and in the context of Juneteenth and everything we've talked about?
Yeah, so fair question. So, you know, if we think about the institution of slavery, if we just take slavery by itself, the benefit was not just simply in that system to those who owned slaves, but it was those who supported that system either, if we think about newspaper editors who ran ads for the sale of slaves or notices about escaped slaves. If we think about industries that supplied slavery. If we think about the forms of labor that supported the slave system among folks who were white, right, who didn't own slaves, this was across the board. Slavery was an organizing principle of that society. And so the benefits were not just simply those, that accrue to those who actually own slaves, but there's those who help to distribute, to sell them, to market them, who supported that system in all these other kinds of ways, who were elected officials, and the psychological wages that white people were able to gain by virtue, right, of being white in a society that elevated that and created these hierarchies. So that's just on slavery itself. But if we think about all that followed, right, in terms of the gains from job, employment opportunities, right, that well after the demise of slavery, there were categories of work and labor that Black people simply could not compete in. They were simply shut out. If we think, for example, the construction trade industries, that's just one example. If we think even later, right, coming into the 20th century, the United States becomes what we might call a middle-class republic due to the ability of mass numbers of people to become homeowners, right? Reasonably, all right?
Yeah.
So that helped to transform this nation. And the benefits of that were largely, right, achieved, experienced by white citizens, right? And the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap that create persists to this day, right? So the question of who owns slaves is only one part of of how we think about the profits, if you will, that come from the existence of racism. But this occurs across the board. It moved from the 19th well into the 20th century. That's a quick response. But these legacies continue in all kinds of ways that may not even directly be linked to slavery, but the legacies that occur after the fact.
Right. So to cap it off, then at Juneteenth, we think about those legacies and take the discussion forward, right? In this progression and regression dynamic that you've talked about.
Can I say this before
Yes.
we leave? I mean, I think the fact that a conversation like this, right, supported, sponsored by the Penn State Alumni Association, these are the kinds of things that we need to continue to do and do more of with more individuals, right? So this is a good way for us to think about how we commemorate Juneteenth. And so that's why the argument is that we all should be engaged in this. And this is not just for a particular slice of the population.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know, Clarence, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Well, Savita, it's always good to spend time with you. All right.
With
So
you
thank you
as well.
and I'll just say to everyone who spent time here, happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth. And I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you again, Clarence Lang, for joining us. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today. You can view a full listing of all our events online and in person at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thank you, everyone. Happy Juneteenth. And we are
Penn State.